Naming the enemy. This will of course be called an, quote, anti-male book. Even the most cautious and circumspect feminist writings are described in this way. The cliché is not only unimaginative, but deafeningly deceptive, making real hearing of what radical feminists are saying difficult, at times even for ourselves. Women and our kind, the earth, the sea, the sky, are the real but unacknowledged objects of attack, victimized as the enemy of the patriarchy, of all its wars, of all its professions. There are feminist works which provide abundant examples of misogynistic statements from authorities in all, quote, fields, in all major societies throughout the millennia of patriarchy. Feminists have also written at length about the actual rapist behavior of professionals, from soldiers to gynecologists. The, quote, custom of widow burning, sati, in India, the Chinese ritual of foot binding, the genital mutilation of young girls in Africa, the massacre of women as witches in, quote, Renaissance Europe, gynocide under the guise of American gynecology and psychotherapy. All are documented facts accessible in the tomes and tombs, libraries of patriarchal scholarship. The contemporary facts of brutal gang rape, of wife beating, of overt and subliminal psychic lobotomizing, all are available. What then can the label anti-male possibly mean when applied to works that expose these facts and invite women to free ourselves? The fact is that the labelers do not intend to convey a rational meaning, not to elicit a thinking process, but rather to block thinking. They do intend the label to carry a deep emotive message, triggering implanted fears of all the fathers and sons, freezing our minds. For to write an, quote, anti-male book is to utter the ultimate blasphemy. Thus, women continue to be intimidated by the label anti-male. Some feel a false need to draw distinctions. For example, quote, I am anti-patriarchal, but not anti-male, end quote. The courage to be logical, the courage to name, would require that we admit to ourselves that males and males only are the originators, planners, controllers, and legitimators of patriarchy. Patriarchy is the homeland of males. It is the fatherland, and men are its agents. The primary resistance to consciousness of this reality is precisely described in Sisterhood is Powerful. Quote, thinking that our man is the exception, and therefore we are the exception among women, end quote. It is in the interest of men, as men in patriarchy perceive their interest, and in a superficial but self-destructive way, of many women to hide this fact, especially from themselves. The use of the label is an indication of intellectual and moral limitations. Despite all the evidence that women are attacked as projections of the enemy, the accuser asks sardonically, quote, do you really think that men are the enemy? End quote. This deception/reversal is so deep that women, even feminists, are intimidated into self-deception, becoming the only self-described oppressed who are unable to name their oppressor, referring instead to vague, quote, forces, quote, roles, quote, stereotypes, quote, constraints, quote, attitudes, quote, influences. This list could go on. The point is that no agent is named, only abstractions. The fact is that we live in a profoundly anti-female society, a misogynistic, quote, civilization, in which men collectively victimize women, attacking us as personifications of their own paranoid fears, as the enemy. Within this society, it is men who rape, who sap women's energy, who deny women economic and political power. To allow oneself to know and name these facts is to commit anti-gynocidal acts. Acting in this way, moving through the mazes of anti-female society, requires naming and overcoming the obstacles constructed by its male agents and token female instruments. As a creative crystallizing of the movement beyond the state of patriarchal paralysis, this book is an act of dispossession, and hence, in a sense beyond the limitations of the label anti-male, it is absolutely anti-androcrat, amazingly anti-male, furiously and finally female. The chart of this voyaging/writing. In traditional accounts, Eastern and Western, of the otherworld journey, there are gates through which the soul must pass. The soul is obliged to say the correct words in order to pass the wardens at each passage. I have already suggested that in women's metapatriarchal otherworld journeying, the wardens are the demonic powers of patriarchy, which assume ghostly forms, that is, are difficult to perceive, and function as noxious gases. Women who are able to name ourselves are thereby empowered to name the demons at each passage. When we say their names, they, in effect, drop dead. To put it another way, the gases drop down, condense, into a merely messy puddle. These warden demons can be seen as personifications of the 8 deadly sins of the fathers. It is significant that in the traditional listing of the quote, deadly sins, deception is not usually named. This non-naming is an indicator of the pervasive deceptiveness of male-constructed quote, morality, which does not name its own primary deadly sin. Deception is in fact all-pervasive. It keeps us running in senseless circles. It sedates and seduces ourselves, freezing and fixing female process, enabling the fathers to feed upon women's stolen energy. The paternal parasites hide their vampirizing of female energy by deceptive posturing, which takes the form of processions, religious, military, judicial, academic, etc. For this reason, I choose to term the processions to name the deception of the fathers. At every turn, the voyagers of this book encounter processions of demons wearing multiform masks. We exorcise them, expelling their deceptions from our minds, ousting these obstacles to our static process. Processions both display and disguise the deadly sins of the fathers. The deception they engender glues the sins into conglomerates, reversing them, representing them as virtues. The following list, which not accidentally may resemble a sort of incantation, is a new naming of the 8 deadly sins of the fathers. Although any listing is necessarily linear, it is clear that these malfunctions, are interconnected, that they feed into each other. Processions. The basic sin of philocracy is deception. The destruction of process through patriarchal processions, which are frozen mirror images of spinning process. Professions. Deadly pride is epitomized in patriarchal professions, which condense the process of knowing into an inert and mystifying thing, quote, body of knowledge. Possession. Androcratic avarice is the demonic possession of female spirit and energy, accomplished not only through political and economic means, but more deeply through male myth. Aggression. The malevolence of male violence, which is in fact usually dispassionate, is misnamed anger, masking the fact that they are the enemy against whom all patriarchal wars are waged, and muting righteous female anger. Obsession. Male lust specializes in genital fixation and fetishism, reflecting a broken integrity of consciousness, generating masculine and feminine role constructs legitimated by pseudo-spiritual religion. Assimilation. Gynocidal gluttony expresses itself in vampirism/cannibalism, feeding upon the living flesh, blood, spirit of women, while tokenism disguises the devastation of the victims. Elimination. Misogynist envy tends inherently toward the elimination of all self-identified women, accomplishing this end through the reconception/reforming of some women into Athena-like accomplices. Fragmentation. Patriarchal sloth has enslaved women, whose creativity is confined by mandatory menial labor and by deceptively glorified subservient social activities, resulting in, quote, busy and enforced feminine sloth. Each of these sins of the fathers is more than a sum of abstractions. Each is incarnated in the institutions of patriarchy and in those who invent, control, and legitimate these institutions. Thus, women's journeying of self-centering becoming, passing through the, quote, gates of God, which block us from our own background, means confronting these deceptive incarnations/demons, naming them and naming their games. Our journeying past these watchful wardens is not linear. Amazing their mazes involves spinning through them at multiple times in multiple ways. Since their names are legion, there is not one simple once-and-for-all name for the demons. Their lecherous litanies are like passages of unholy scripture, which they repeat over and over again, and which have many levels of deception, not perceptible all at once. They become more perceptible as we learn to name ourselves, become ourselves more adequately. Concomitant with the amazing struggle, which is exorcism, is the ecstatic process of spinsters discovering the labyrinth of our own unfolding/becoming. Passing through the male-made mazes is not simply a preliminary lap of the journey. It makes way for and accompanies the ecstatic labyrinth journey of survivors. In this book, I will chart/describe this amazing and spinning voyage. That is, I will write about the fundamental, quote, blind alleys of the master's maze, which hide the passages of the labyrinth way of ecstasy. I will be concerned with discovering the Father's processions, and with breaking away from them. The voyage will involve encounters with the other 7 deadly sins/demons as well. These encounters are recurrent and in random order, as the demons appear and reappear at various points, attempting to block our way. The voyage of this book moves through 3 passages. As the terrain changes, so also does the style of the explorer, her movement, her language. In the first passage, there is an exuberance of discovery as the voyager breaks through the barriers of obsolete myths which block vision. There is the constant surprise of seeing what is on the other side of the hill, and on all sides as the scope of vision broadens and deepens. In the second passage, there is a soberness and focused attention as the explorer encounters the unnatural enemies of female being in their multiple postures of indecent exposure. There is a focused intensity as she marks the snares laid by the deadly game trappers, analyzing the archetypical atrocities in order to unmask the lethal intent of the death dealers. In the third passage, having perceived the intent of the gynocidal gamesters, she moves deeper into the other world, which is her own time/space. Her style reflects her newfound capacity to recognize their intent in its seemingly innocent and chillingly familiar manifestations. Their chivalry, their help, their care, their art, their romance, their respect, their rewards, their blessings, their love. This new knowing, her beatific vision, encourages her to invent new modes of being/speaking, which are spooking, sparking, spinning. My charting and describing are inspired by many Four-Sisters, since all who have embarked on this journey are, quote, contemporaries, in the only sense that matters, the century or span of decades measured by patriarchal time in which, quote, his history places each of us is far less relevant than our own network of communication. All women who define our own living, defying the deception of patriarchal history, are journeying. We belong to the same time. We are Four-Sisters to each other. Here, in this volume, my charting and describing is inspired in a particular way by the words of one Four-Sister, Virginia Woolf, who in her profoundly anti-patriarchal book, 3 Guineas, asks, quote, "What are these ceremonies and why should we take part in them? What are these professions and why should we make money out of them? Where, in short, is it leading us, the procession of the sons of educated men?" End quote. In this prophetic book, published in the 1930s, she shows connections among the absurd professional processions, displaying their deception, their morbidity and meaninglessness. She advises us to, quote, break the ring, the vicious circle, the dance round and round the mulberry tree, the poison tree of intellectual harlotry. End quote. The circle of processions and professions is linked to possession. Of women's dilemma, she writes, quote, "Behind us lies the patriarchal system, the private house, with its nullity, its immorality, its hypocrisy, its servility. Before us lies the public world, the professional system, with its possessiveness, its jealousy, its pugnancy, its greed. The one shuts us up like slaves in a harem. The other forces us to circle, like caterpillars, head to tail, round and round the mulberry tree, the sacred tree of property. It is a choice of evils. Each is bad." End quote. Yes, and each is part of the same system of patriarchal possession, whose primary property is female life. The writing/journeying of this book passes/spins through the phallocratic maze. Yet the other side of this otherworld journeying is discovered at every turn. This is the ecstatic side. It involves speaking in various modes: spooking, sparking, spinning. Although there is no, quote, one-to-one correlation between the exercising and the ecstatic movements, there is a kind of moving pattern, a spiraling of counterpoints, a harmony of hearing and speaking. Our acts of exercising are rites of passage, by which we win rites of passage. In the process of encountering and naming the male factors, who freeze process into processions, hoard knowing within professions, and kill creativity by possession, I point out clues which, as they are recognized, disclose the living process which has been hidden, caricatured, captured, stunted, but never completely killed by the phallocratic sins. These clues point to a force which is beyond, behind, beneath the patriarchal death march, an unquenchable gynergy. They serve as raw material for a process of alchemy. We can transmute the base metals of man-made myth by becoming unmute, calling forth from ourselves and each other the courage to name the unnameable.